Good evening. My name is Allison Kaplan. I'm Director of Education at the National First Ladies Library at the National First Ladies Historic Site in Canton, Ohio. And I'm so excited to welcome you to tonight's Curators Talk. We're really excited because we have a special guest this evening. But before I turn it over to our guest, I want to mention some of our upcoming programs. You may have seen them scrolling on the screen, as I know there are still people entering the talk through webinar or Facebook tonight. I will mention a few of them, and I also want to encourage people for our talk tonight. If you have questions for our speaker, if you have technical issues, questions about the talk, please enter them into the chat, whether you're on Facebook or you're in our Zoom webinar. Please enter your questions in the chat and we will get to them at the end of the talk, or we are happy to troubleshoot with you. So hopefully you can hear me. So I wanted to mention some of a few upcoming activities here. So we have a Ladies in the Lab STEM kit. If you have children at home, grandchildren who want to keep busy, learn about amazing ladies in STEM, science, or STEAM, we have a great kit. This month, we are featuring African-American ophthalmologist Patricia Bath. So you can learn about a first woman in science, breaking barriers, and make some cool things. So that activity is available through our Eventbrite. If you are here for tonight's talk, you might also be interested in other First Lady related talks and activities. So coming up on Monday, we have a program with Sarah, the First Lady Chef. She hosts the blog and the web series Cooking with the First Ladies. And we are super excited because we are traveling back in time to the 1970s and pulling out our Allman Brothers records, putting on our bell bottoms, and getting out our peanuts to make some peanut butter pie in honor of Rosalind Carter. Sarah does really fun programs. They have a lot of history, a lot of information about First Ladies, and a lot of really fun retro cooking. So if you're not signed up for that, please head over to our Eventbrite, our Facebook, or our website to get more information about that program. And as always, a lot of our programs are streamable on YouTube after the fact. So if you're looking for something fun to do, you can see some of the past programs, or if you want to recommend this talk tonight to a friend, you can find it on our page. We also have a virtual book club, and in May 24th, we will be featuring the work of Amy Bloom. It's a fictional work about Eleanor Roosevelt. We're going to look at a fictional work this spring related to Eleanor, and then handle her big old new biography that is just out in the fall. So there's plenty of time to read that one, as well as breeze through this next title next month. So we are excited about that. And then next month, if you're excited about fashion, you will want to join us for our virtual legacy lecture. We are going to be hosting curator Gwendolyn Dubois Shaw from the National Portrait Gallery, who curated the very first exhibition that they have had of First Lady portraiture. And it features a lot of fashion, as well as that amazing Millie dress that is featured in the portrait of Michelle Obama. So we're super excited about that. And it as well features a work from the National First Ladies library collection by Elizabeth Keckley, and Keckley will be mentioned tonight. So there will be more talk about fashion for that. So we're really excited about all of those upcoming programs, and we're hoping that you can join us soon. And we're excited for you to join us for tonight's talk. So I am very excited to introduce our speaker tonight, Petra Slinkard, who oversees the Peabody Essex Museum of Museum's Fashion and Textile collection, as well as the newly opened Fashion and Design Gallery. In 2020, she curated the exhibition Made It, the Women Who Revolutionized Fashion, which just closed this past month and is organized in association with The Hague. Um, in her role as Director of Curatorial Affairs, Slinkard manages the Peabody Essex Museum's dynamic curatorial team, develops departmental priorities for the museum, and the strategies to execute them. So we are super excited to have Petra here tonight to speak about this exhibition. I know my cat behind me is very excited as well to be featured for the second time, I think, on our feed. So I am going to turn things over to Petra. And again, if you have questions this evening, please put them in the chat and we will address them after the talk. Thank you so much for coming and thanks for being here, Petra, sorry.
Hello, Allison. Thank you so much for that lovely introduction. I am thrilled to be here with you. I'm honored to be invited to speak with such a great audience. It looks like we have about 90 people or so on this call, and that is just exciting as all can be. And I'm grateful to Michelle and Jenny and Allison for your support and invitation this evening on behalf of the National First Ladies Library. So if you bear with me for just a moment, I am going to share my screen. And if you do at any point have questions, as Allison mentioned, please drop those into the chat or the Q&A box, and we will address all those questions at the end. So one moment, and here we go. And hopefully, can everyone see that? I think so. Great. So as I mentioned, it is my pleasure to be here this evening to talk about an exhibition that is really near and dear to me, and that is Made It, the Women Who Revolutionized Fashion. And as Allison said, this is an exhibition that unfortunately just closed on March 14th, and it opened on November 21st, just before Thanksgiving. And this exhibition, I should know, was actually slated to open in May. But of course, as everyone knows, the COVID-19 pandemic sort of wreaked havoc across the country and across the globe, and certainly changed a lot of people's plans unexpectedly. And this exhibition was one of those that we were fortunate enough to be able to open, even if it was a little bit later than initially planned. So as Allison mentioned, this is a collaboration that we did with the Kunstmuseum Den Haag, which is the art museum in The Hague in the Netherlands. And I had the opportunity to travel to the Netherlands to see the first iteration of this exhibition, which was titled Femme Fatales, Sterke Vrouwen in de Mode, which translates to Femme Fatales, Strong Women in Fashion. And this is an exhibition that our co-curator, Natalie Shannon, who is the originating curator of this exhibition, conceived in 2018. And she did so because she was responding in part to the Women's March that took place in 2017, but she was also taking a moment to look around and noticed that many of these reputable fashion houses, such as Givenchy or Christian Dior, were for the first time in their history now being run by women. And so that was definitely a point of inspiration for her. And as she and I spoke about what the possibilities to bring this exhibition to the United States might be, they were very gracious in allowing us to adjust the title, to add pieces from our own collection, and really expand the story to include a more comprehensive American story as well. So in essence, we borrowed, there are 107 mannequins in the exhibition, and the exhibition covers about 250 years of fashion design. We borrowed 60 pieces from the Kunstmuseum. We worked with our colleagues at the Chicago History Museum, the Museum of Fine Arts in Boston. We augmented with pieces from our own collection, and we also worked with 2 private collectors. So it was quite a feat to accomplish during this time. And at its core, at its heart, Made It, the exhibition, recognized recognizes, reveals, and celebrates the many women who radically impacted Western fashion. We also look at women and how they shaped all periods of fashion and how their stories intersect with the history of women's ongoing struggle for equality. And so this is a good point to make, because I'm sure that, as many of you know, 2020 was a hallmark anniversary year for women's rights, and that being, of course, the 100th anniversary of the ratification of the 19th Amendment for the US Constitution, which granted women the right to vote, but it did not guarantee it. And so we were looking for an opportunity to honor this hallmark and to present information that not only cast a light on all of the different ways in which women throughout our history have persevered, but to do so with fashion allowed us an opportunity to sort of pick apart, if you will, various aspects of the industry and how women continually impacted the industry over the course of these 250 years. And so we asked individuals who visited our exhibition to join us as we recognized women as makers and innovators of fashion by celebrating their enterprising spirits and revealing their lasting impact on this evolving industry. And so now I'm going to play a video because since you couldn't be in the exhibition yourselves, I think it's always nice before we begin to allow you at least a glimpse into what the feel and the look and the experience of the exhibition might be like. There is music, so I will just warn you so you're not startled, but there are no words, and then we'll continue from there. It's about 2.5 minutes long. Okay, so now hopefully I can continue without starting it over. I always have a little bit of trouble with that. There we go. Okay. So as people entered the gallery, they were confronted with this one single ensemble, which is simple enough, of course. It's a white t-shirt with a black blazer and a pair of blue jeans. And on the front of the t-shirt are the words, "We should all be feminists." And we did this deliberately for a couple of reasons. One, of course, is the term feminist is one that I think holds a variety of meaning for a variety of people. And for some, it is quite a loaded term. For others, it is a celebratory term. But we wanted to acknowledge that this statement being made by a designer was one way in which we could kick off this conversation and honor the efforts of two women specifically, but also to acknowledge that this is an exhibition that is really about multiple voices. And so we look to Made It, the exhibition, not only as this manner to honor this 100th anniversary, but also to consider consider that fashion is society's mirror, and that fashion, these clothes, that they illuminate our narratives and they communicate so much about who we are and how we want to be seen. And that it also represents this segment of our world economy, and that unfortunately, because of our seemingly sort of inexhaustible thirst for novelty and necessity, the sheer ubiquity of fashion can often obscure the labor and the creativity that brings it into being. And so, as I mentioned, this term, "we should all be feminists," put on a t-shirt, was sort of the brainchild of two women. On the right, Chimamanda Ngozi Adichie, who is the Nigerian author who penned a manifesto, if you will, entitled "We Should All Be Feminists," which she delivered during a TED Talk. And this was a piece that she had written in honor of her friend's recent birth to a young man. And she was thinking to herself, what advice might I give this young man? And in this manifesto is her advice, as she titled, "We Should All Be Feminists." And on the left-hand side, you have Maria Grazia Chiuri, who is an Italian designer who, for the first time in the history of the house of Christian Dior, became the first female creative director. Christian Dior was founded in 1947 by Christian Dior, of course, proper, and then continued to be led by a variety of men until Maria Grazia Chiuri took over. And so for her first collection, right out of the gate, she not only wanted to make an impact for herself and a statement, but she also wanted to point that there was a new direction on the horizon for the house of Christian Dior. And so again, whether we agree with that term, feminist, or if we agree with that statement, "We should all be feminists," I think we can agree that it is a powerful statement. Regardless of what side we land on. But as we scope out from that single object, we start to see these bubbles that surround this ensemble. And this is where we start to acknowledge the tension, that there are so many voices that inform this particular story. And so this exhibition actually operated on three different levels. You have the ensembles, and where we really dig into the designer history, the personal history of these enterprising and innovative women. Then we have the collection, the groupings, the themes that we embark upon that really speak to fashion history. And then even further out, there are moments where we, as an umbrella to the entire experience, we hone in on various aspects of women's history, particularly in the United States as it pertains to labor laws, but other themes that emerge, not even themes that I was necessarily concentrated on, were that of single working mothers, of women who immigrated to the United States. And so there are so many different layers to this story that it was really an honor to be able to work on it. So some of the individuals who are featured in those circles, you see a quote by Lucy Stone, the suffragette: "I think with never-ending gratitude that the young women of today do not and can never know at what price their right to free speech and to speak at all in public has been earned." Or an individual like Hattie Carnegie, an immigrant to the United States who changed her last name in honor of the most wealthy man in the United States, in a sort of, if you think it and be it, you can become it philosophy, who says, "I don't ever think I will actually climb to the top of the ladder, as I'm always adding more rungs." And so from this moment where we really root people in the 21st century, in this moment of now, with a uniform that is to varying degrees ubiquitous among women everywhere, we immediately jump back into history. And we have 5 ensembles that were on loan to us from the Kunstmuseum that represent design of the mid-18th century. And these are really phenomenal gowns. And this is really a moment where we can start to look at how the clothing trade of the 18th and 19th centuries really catered to the royal courts and the fashion centers of Europe, but that this trade was really strictly divided along the gender lines. And that was because of the guild system. And the guild system was tightly controlled by men. And the idea here is that it's the fabric of these ensembles that was so expensive that that's really where the wealth is. That was considered a luxury good. And so the idea is that if you purchased this fabric and you were going to entrust it to someone to cut it, you could only entrust it to the hands hands of a man, because a man is steady, his hands are steady, he knows what he's doing. And then once the pattern pieces were laid and the pieces were cut, then the ensembles were, or the pieces were then sort of passed over to women, the seamstresses, who worked in some servitude to the tailors to piece these ensembles together. And so this is why we titled this section Breaking In, because it was only when women started to realize, like, hey, this system doesn't work without us, is that they started to poke holes in it, and they started to form their own guilds, and they started to carve out space for themselves in this industry. And this is really where we start to see the foundation of these enterprising women take hold. This is a photo of me in the gallery. We did use mirrors as an opportunity for visitors to see the back of the ensembles, but also for an opportunity for you to see yourself in context with these historical garments. And so, as I said, as competition grew, as the industry grew in the clothing trade, women were able to seek out new positions for themselves. And then we go into a section that firmly roots us in the late 19th century into the 20th century. And we have this quote here that kicks us off by I.W. Wells: "The way to right wrongs is to turn the light of truth upon them." And this section was titled Gaining Momentum. And this is probably one of the more dense sections in the gallery. As you can see on the left-hand side, this is where you're entering the gallery. And then as you turn that wall, this is the view in the center of the gallery. And here we begin with three ensembles. On the left-hand side, we have the work of Lucy Duff Gordon, who is a woman who not only survived the sinking of the Titanic, but she also very, very well understood what it meant to be a good businesswoman. She was able to create outlets in Europe, both in London and in Paris, and expand her outlets into the United States in cities like Chicago and New York. She specialized in lingerie and then eventually found her way into evening wear. But one of the things that she really sort of began was what she called her mannequin parades. And these are the precursors to today's fashion shows, our runway presentations. And she understood, because she taught her models how to walk, that if a woman felt confident in her clothing, if she carried the clothing well, that would make other women, or perhaps the husbands of those women, interested in buying that clothing. And so she was a very savvy businesswoman. The ensemble in the center is by Jean Paquin, who's a French couturier, female French couturier, of course, whose salon was situated among her male contemporaries, but she was also the first female to be elected by her all-male peers to serve as the president of the Chambre du Syndicat de la Couture. And this is the governing body for the entire couture industry. And so I think it really says a lot about the respect that her male peers had for her, but also the ability and the quality of her designs that garnered that respect for her to occupy that position. And then we hone in on, I'm sorry, I should go back, the black and white checkered piece on the right-hand side. And this is, of course, a very important piece for United States history. And that is an ensemble that is attributed to be designed by Elizabeth Hobbs Keckley. Elizabeth Hobbs Keckley was born in 1818 in the United States. She was a Black woman born into slavery. And she was a phenomenal seamstress, dressmaker, or what we would call a mantua maker. And she was able to leverage her dressmaking skills to eventually purchase her own freedom from the family that enslaved her, and to purchase the freedom of her son. And once she had done so, she immediately moved to Washington, D.C. She set up her own shop and became the go-to dressmaker for the political and social elite of Washington, D.C. And of course, among those individuals was probably her best known client, which is First Lady Mary Todd Lincoln. And I have her positioned here with Charles Frederick Worth, who in fashion history, if you're familiar with fashion history, in fashion history books, has been touted for years and years and years as the father of haute couture. And this is in no way to detract from Charles Frederick Worth's impact or legacy, but I see these individuals as peers. We have two individuals, Charles Frederick Worth designing for the royal courts of Europe, and Elizabeth Hobbs Keckley designing for our royal court, the First Lady of the United States of America. And yet Charles Frederick Worth's name has gone down over and over and over as the father of haute couture. And really, up until about the last 20 or so years, Elizabeth Hobbs Keckley's name has not been exalted in the manner that it should be. And I will say that she has recently been, getting more respect that she absolutely deserves. This is the ensemble with both the cape and without the cape, so you can really see the shape and the silhouette. But I think what it does is it also very clearly exhibits her ability as an artist to put together an ensemble with the line of buttons down the front. I mean, Mary Todd Lincoln was not a very tall woman. She was actually quite short. She was a little bit stout. And so you'd think to put some exaggerated pattern like this on her would sort of swallow her up. And yet because of Keckley's sense of balance and her aesthetic, it was really a very beautiful and sophisticated ensemble. And this was on loan to us from the Chicago History Museum. As I mentioned in the beginning, at every opportunity, we really tried to privilege the voices of these particular designers. And so we paired their labels with photographs or quotes whenever possible. Then we move on to an ensemble designed by a suffragette from Boston, because of course, the Peabody Essex Museum, and I'm not sure if we mentioned this or not, is in Salem, Massachusetts, which is just outside of Boston. And this is designed by Maria Teresa Baldwin-Hollander. And Mrs. Hollander started her business designing children's clothes at the same time that her husband started his business. And unfortunately, her husband's business failed. But hers was quite a success. And so he actually closed his shop and joined forces with her. And they established, which would later become known as L.P. Hollander and Company. Her sons joined the business, and L.P. Hollander and Company ended up becoming a very reputable outlet for high fashion on the East Coast. And so as we see this story continue, we start to see these women really, as I said, carve out space for themselves in this crowded market. And then as we scope out, we see a line of clothes designs by individuals from L.P. Hollander on the left-hand side to that of Hattie Carnegie, to Sally Milgram, which is the beautiful black evening gown that is sparkling. And Milgram, of course, designed the inauguration gown for Eleanor Roosevelt. We have two ensembles by Jean Levan. We have Elsa Schiaparelli, and then finally Gabrielle Coco Chanel on the end. Again, thinking and talking about each of these women individually as business women, as this idea of gaining momentum. And then across the top, we see moments or facts throughout our history that again reinforce the way in which women were gaining momentum in our history, in the workforce, and how they were also leveraging their positions in the workforce to impact human rights, labor rights, children's rights, and making quite a bit of impact there. So then we moved to a small section that we titled The American Look, or All American. And this really hones in and focuses on the 20th century. When the Nazis invaded Paris in the 1930s, Paris shut down. And it was absolutely acceptable up until that point for American manufacturers and for retailers to outright copy what was coming out of Paris. That was the name of the game. And so when Paris did shut down, the retailers and the journalists were absolutely kind of went wild, because they thought, well, what are we going to do? What are we going to promote? What are we going to sell? And there were several people, but one very astute woman by the name of Dorothy Shaver, who worked for Lord and Taylor, had already started to plant the seed. But she sort of looked around to her colleagues and said, we do have talented designers here, and they do have names. And so that's actually what she started to do, was to promote this American talent for an American audience. And so here on the screen from the left to the right, we have designers such as Claire McCardle, Anne Lowe, Bonnie Cashin, or Frankie Welch on the right-hand side, who is a self-identified Cherokee designer who is still living and was a very close designer with First Lady Betty Ford. And here we have Jean Muir, who says, clothes do not make a statement. The woman makes a statement and the dress helps. And we hone in here on Claire McCardle, who says, I've often wondered why clothes had to be delicate, why they couldn't be practical and sturdy, as well as feminine. And so on the left-hand side, you see the dress that's in our show, and on the right-hand side, you see it depicted in a photograph. And I think we might all agree that, while the fabric itself is rather underwhelming, but in Claire's hands, the way that she miters the fabric, the way that she produces this ensemble is really quite sophisticated and lovely. And so here we see it featured in the exhibition on a chair next to designs by Tina Leeser, Adele Simpson, who also designed for a variety of first ladies, including Lady Bird Johnson and Pauline Trégère. And then on the left-hand side, we have our storefront window, which is a nod to this history of retail. And within that window, we have designs by Elizabeth Hawes and Anne Lowe. And Anne Lowe is another name that's probably familiar to you, but as you can see here, written by Thomas Condon Jr., Anne Lowe was society's best kept secret. It says rich women passed her name among themselves. Some have even cheated her, but few outsiders have heard of Anne Lowe, the only Negro to become a leading American dressmaker. And Anne Lowe was a woman who was born in Clayton, Alabama, in the late 1800s, and she was a phenomenal couturier. And I use that word deliberately because couturier typically is only reserved for the French, but I do think that her design, her skill set was absolutely on par with her male peers, being Christian Dior or Balenciaga. She was known for her hand-turned silk roses, which she began fashioning as a child as she picked up scraps from her mother's studio or dressmaking studio. And she became, as the article indicated, a favorite among the social elite, specializing in debutante gowns, which you see here in the center, which was on view in Made It and on loan from the Chicago History Museum. Of course, to her probably most iconic work, and that is the wedding dress of Jacqueline Kennedy. And then we move to a section that hones in on the work of sisters and sort of this idea of families banding together, but more specifically sisters. And the two ensembles that you see in the foreground are from the 1920s and represent that kind of classic flapper look. And that is by the sisters Callot, or Calosseurs in French. And as the quote here declares from Vogue magazine in 1916, the foremost among the powers that rule the destinies of a woman's life and increase the income of France were Calosseurs. And so what I find to be really interesting and powerful about that particular quote is that not only were these ladies broadcasting the fact that they were women, but that they were also sisters in their label, but that there was also this sense of national pride that was enveloping them as they grew in their successes. And then we move into a four-part section called Seismic Shifts. And Seismic Shifts starts in the 1920s. And we have the beautiful ensemble in the center, which is designed by Maria Monasai Galenga, which is really from the 19-teens. But what it does is it starts to position us to understand that the flapper silhouette, that classic raised hem, dropped waist silhouette wasn't just something that happened overnight, but that it was a gradual process that had been adopted by the intelligentsia. And as we move forward and look at specifically the 1920s dresses that would have been associated with the flappers, we use a statement that women of the 1920s were aware that they looked different and that they liked it. The fabrics glistened with the use of beading, and these clothes are really made for movement. And one of the pieces that we feature, which you see on the far right-hand side, and again here on the left-hand side, is by the House of Jenny from 1927, which is a really rare ensemble. And then we transition to the 1930s, where the majority of these ensembles are from the 1930s. And we see that the silhouette starts to shift. And part of this is due to a technique that is developing in dressmaking, and that is the bias cut. So changing and shifting the alteration of how you would cut along the grain of the fabric from on grain to a 45-degree angle. And what that does is it creates this beautiful sinuous spiral to the dresses. And this was a silhouette that has continued, and a technique that has continued to be used in the 20th century into the 21st century, particularly in wedding attire, formal attire. You see it lots on the red carpet. But one individual in particular who really perfected this technique is the French couturier Madeleine Vionnet. And you can see her here really looking to sculpt the fabric around a mannequin here, or a half dress form, and the piece on the left-hand side exemplifies that. Then we move into a section where we start to talk about swimwear. And swimwear was a really interesting way, I think, to get at, all of the ridicule that women have had to deal with over the years. So if we think of kind of the saggy wool, blue or black traditional bathing suits from the turn of the century, the early 1900s into the 1920s, we can, I think, agree that this collection of fantastic swimsuits from the mid-1950s by Tina Leeser, Rosemary Reed, and Carolyn Shorner, while maybe by our own standards today still feels a little cumbersome and a little overdone, but that it was a great departure from that sort of wool, saggy, itchy ensemble that would have been worn previously. And these designers were interested in function and fashion. And we really start to see that meld here. And then with the debut of the modern bikini in 1946, it really prompted women to begin to think about design not only as functional, but also fashionable. But more importantly, it allowed us to reclaim the presentation of our bodies. And maybe that was to be fully covered or to be fully exposed. And so two designers that we focus in on here, the two ensembles in the foreground, or the two suits in the foreground, are designed by a contemporary designer, Becca McCarran-Tran, who says in her own words, "It's time to explode our historically narrow view of beauty." And the suit that you see on the left-hand side is actually a photograph taken by the contemporary photographer Dana Scruggs of a woman wearing a wet t-shirt, and that is used as the print for this swimsuit collection called the Wet Launch Collection. And Becca McCarran-Tran's company, Chromat, from its outset in 2010, has been very focused and very vocal about being accepting of all bodies, of trans bodies, of people who are looking to present themselves in the manner that they choose. And then the ensemble just behind the burkini is designed by a Lebanese designer who's working out of Australia by the name of Ahida Zanetti. And she says in her own words, "I created the burkini to give women freedom, not to take it away." And she presented this ensemble that she designed in collaboration with the Islamic community in Australia, after watching her niece really struggle, enveloped in clothing, to play sports. And what she found is that not only were women seeking out this particular activewear as a means of respectful or modesty dress, but also individuals who suffered from skin cancer, who wanted to be more fully covered. And so there were a variety of individuals reaching out to her for this particular design. Then we move into a section that hones in on the 1960s. And it's always really interesting for me to go from the 1920s to the 1960s, because even though the fabrics are different, the patterns are totally different, if we really hone in on the silhouette, we see that the silhouette is actually not that different. And as Deanna Vreeland says in her own words, fashion is a part of the daily air, and it changes all the time with all the events, and you can see and feel everything in clothes. And I love this quote because what the 1960s really did was it turned the tables. Fashion for so long had been a sort of a one-way conversation, with designers producing designs and the consumer sort of accepting what was being designed. And really in the at this point in the 20th century is when we start to see the consumers, the customers, the people on the street really start to take ownership of what it was that they wanted to wear, and demand that of the retailers, demand that of the designers, who were really scrambling to sort of keep up with the times. And so one of the designers that we feature here is that of Mary Quant, who of course you can't speak of the miniskirt without speaking of Mary Quant. And as she says in her own words, "It wasn't me or Courage who invented the miniskirt, it was the girls in the streets who did it." And then our second to last section called Making Choices. We have a selection of evening wear designed by contemporary designers. So on the left-hand side, we have Carolina Herrera, who's designed for a slew of First Ladies. I think she was a favorite of First Lady Barbara Bush and Laura Bush. And then we have Isabella Toledo in the center, which is this aubergine, very sculptural dress called the wave dress, who of course designed the ensemble that First Lady Michelle Obama wore to the inauguration parade. To Sarah Burton, who is that beautiful mustard yellow dress for the company Alexander McQueen. And then this foursome on the right-hand side, which is designed by the avant-garde Japanese designer Rei Kawakubo for her company called Comme des Garçons. And Comme des Garçons actually translates to like the boys. And the quote that we used to represent Rei Kawakubo is that she doesn't design for women who dress for, she doesn't design for women who care what their husbands think. And I think that that's a really powerful quote, because she absolutely is looking at clothing not to accentuate the female form, but rather to use the form as an armistice for her sort of wearable sculpture. And then, as this quote indicates, to be modern is to really be aware of what is going on. And that is a quote by the French designer Sonia Rykiel. And this is sort of a very disparate selection of clothing. But from the left-hand side, we have designs by Laura Ashley, of course, the very infamous and iconic Diane von Furstenberg's wrap dress, to a pantsuit by Sonia Rykiel, to this red dress in the center from the 1950s, designed by the French house Carman, who was really looking at and honing in her talents on sizing. So in this case, it was petite wear, but of course, this is also the moment where Lane Bryant and other companies are really, taking off, even though Lane Bryant was founded much earlier, but thinking that not all women come in one size. To the piece on the far right-hand side, which represents maternity wear, to the Anne de Meulemeester on the top row, showing and exposing a midriff. And that this is as the title indicates, making choices. This is an opportunity for women to decide how they wanted to be presented in society. And just a moment to focus in on the Diane von Furstenberg wrap dress from 1975 that was intended to be worn to work, to the club, with a bra, without a bra, but it was a very versatile and seemingly very simple garment, and yet really exploded. And then a subsection of this section, Making Choices, was called All Business. And this was really a moment for us to kind of hone in on the idea that women were joining the workforce with greater numbers than ever before in the 20th century. And that in the mid 20th century, exampled here on our crosswalk that was supposed to symbolize, women in the city going to work, you see a really wonderful selection of mid 20th century designs. And that these women really started to adopt suits that mirrored what they saw in their male-dominated work environments. But then on the right-hand side, you start to see more contemporary designs of the late 20th century into the early 21st century by designers by Anne de Meulemeester, Prada, Phoebe Philo for Celine, or Donna Karan. And that we note that as power dynamics shifted in the last 50 years, that women no longer feared dismantling their hard-fought progress, and that they were going to present themselves in the ways that they felt was correct. And so we hone in here on an ensemble by Donna Karan from 1985 from her 7 Easy Pieces collection, which was really the precursor to what we might now refer to as our capsule collection, 7 distinct pieces that were all intended to go to with one another in combination. But I also include an advertisement here because, again, the story of the fashion design doesn't just end with the designers or the ensembles, but it's really a part of a much more cohesive and integrated conversation that pertains to retail, that pertains to fashion journalism and to advertising. And of course, here we have a rather provocative for the time advertisement where a woman is being sworn in as president in a Donna Karan ad. And then in our final section, we look at fashion, as the title indicates, designing for change, as a catalyst for change. So on the left-hand side, we have a contemporary design by the Mexican designer Carla Fernandez, who designed this ensemble. It's one of 3 in the world that she made for the Women's March, to be worn at the Women's March. And you'll notice the protest signs in the background, and the one behind her is deliberately left blank because it's the ensemble that actually is the protest sign, and we wanted to reinforce that. To the coat, the leopard coat, which is a faux leopard coat designed by Norma Kamali, who was a designer very early on in the 1980s and into the 1990s, who was really pushing herself and the industry to think about animals' rights and to think about fair practices in this, to the designer Vivian Tam, who is using the likeness of Chairman Mao in her designs, almost in a Warholian, Warhol-esque attempt to sort of break down some of the themes there. And then we have Vivian Westwood, who's working as early as 1981 with designer or artist Keith Haring. So really melding the idea of street and graffiti culture with high fashion, to Zondra Rose on the right-hand side, who is borrowing from punk culture to create her ensemble for her conceptual chic collection of 1977. So using safety pins and deliberate rips in the garments to create these rather provocative ensembles. To Catherine Hamnett, who, in her own words, says you can't not read a t-shirt. And of course, we probably know her best for revealing her t-shirt while she met the Margaret Thatcher, that said 58% don't want Pershing, to these t-shirts that she's designed more recently, which are Protest and Survive, No More Fashion Victims, or Choose Love. And then we finish with 5 designers, which we could have, included 100 more, but that we really felt sort of represented where fashion is going, moving forward, and that there were a growing number of contemporary designers who recognize the need to rethink and reform their practices as a path forward is laid for a new generation of designers, wearers, and industry professionals. And those designers are from the top row, left to right. We have Mary Katranzow. We have a Native American designer who is Lusueno Shoshana Bannock by the name of Jamie Akuma, to the Dutch contemporary designer Iris van Erpen, who of course is creating very ethereal, almost kinetic sculpture worn on the body, to the 2 ensembles in the front. On the left-hand side, Natalie Shannon for her company Alabama Shannon, and Tracy Reese for her new company Hope for Flowers. And specifically, I wanted to focus on Natalie Shannon and Alabama Shannon for a moment, because this really represents a turning point in her personal history, where she went from a designer and a stylist working in New York and in Europe to returning to her hometown of Florence, Alabama, which was a hub of t-shirt making in the United States. That industry had collapsed, and she really set about to create a system that would support the workers in that area, and these very highly skilled workers, and pay them a fair and competitive wage to create these beautiful one-of-a-kind ensembles. And to Tracy Reese's collection, Hope for Flowers, her new collection launched 2 years ago, and it is a sustainable brand, where she actually started, says in her own words that there was a moment in her fashion career where she decided, she needed to sort of take stock of what she was producing, and started to, think about how she could have a positive impact on the fashion industry. So not only is her company really thinking about sustainable practices, but she is also based in Detroit, and again, employing people in her community. And then we end the exhibition with this dedication for women everywhere who pour their hearts and creativity into making fashion for all. We see you and we honor you. Because while there were 107 mannequins in the exhibition, I think we told the stories of about 75 individual fashion houses and people. That's only a drop in the bucket for all of the people across the globe who are contributing to this industry on a manufacturing level, on a design level, on a shipping level. This is a worldwide billion-dollar industry, and we wanted to take a moment for all those people whose names and faces we would never see or know, to honor them. And so there is a book available if you're interested in learning more, that can be purchased online or at the PEM shop if you're interested. And people always ask me a little bit about behind the scenes, so I thought I'd take you very briefly on a quick tour of our behind the scenes. So these are our mannequins in various stages of dress, kind of waiting to be moved into the galleries and put in their specific locations. We worked with a very talented team of conservators and art handlers. On the right-hand side, you see the understructure that was used for those 18th century dresses, because we never alter a garment or the artwork to fit the mannequin. We always alter the mannequin to fit the artwork. And of course, as I mentioned at the beginning, we did all of this during Zoom. So our colleagues from the Netherlands were not able to join us on site in Salem, but we had to sort of adjust our schedules, and we did a lot of Zoom and video and photo sharing in order for them to feel comfortable about how their places were placed and put together. And then this is just a quick time lapse, maybe if I can get there, to show you a little bit of the dressing that takes place and how many hands are required in order to make that happen. And then, of course, just to reinforce the idea that while I have the opportunity and the privilege to sit here and talk to you about this exhibition, it absolutely takes an entire team, and in this case, 2 museums, to put this exhibition together. If you want to learn more and you are active on social media, we use the hashtag #MadeItFashion, and there are a lot of photos that visitors took online on Instagram or on Facebook that you can learn more. And that is it. So I will stop sharing and see what kind of questions we might have.
Thank you so much, Petra. That was wonderful. We had a lot of comments that people were just so excited to have an opportunity to see the show and to see the
Thank you.
works, and grateful for you to be here. I have a question for you about the title of the exhibition. So
Yeah.
I am really curious about the title change and the partnering institution calling it femme fatale, because I always sort of assume that as a negative term related to women, when this is a really empowering exhibition. So I wonder if you could talk a little bit more about the decisions behind the title.
Yeah, no, that's a great question. I'm glad that you said that. So for my colleagues in the Netherlands, and I can only presume here because I'm not speaking for them, but their exhibition was much more focused on the idea of protest. As I said, it was really inspired by the Women's March. And so the heart of their exhibition was actually staged as a protest. And then they were, of course, talking about the European pioneers like the Lanvins and the Chanels and the Schiaparellis. And I think that there was a sense of kind of allure, but also a little bit of danger in, these women who, might kind of sort of the idea that they might sneak up on you and sort of catch you by surprise, if you will. Whereas for our installation, we took a little bit more of a direct approach. And we really did, because the 100th anniversary of the ratification of the 19th Amendment is specific to the United States, we had a little bit more leeway there. And as I said, they were wonderful partners. They let us add and subtract and do as much as we wanted to the exhibition from its original content. And it so for us, we really did want it to be about empowerment and to use this fashion as a parallel to the advancements of women's history. And so that double entendre of made it is sort of where we settled, where it was truly about the actual making and the conceptualization of these garments, but also the idea of that aspirational made it too.
I wonder, that's a great, I love the title and the double meaning of it. That's
Thank
really
you.
cool. Can you speak a little bit about the hurdles that women face in the fashion industry? So you are featuring women designers. As we have been preparing at National First Ladies for an exhibition that focuses on Anne Lowe, we've been talking a lot, and you spoke a little bit at the beginning about the different titles that women versus men might have in the fashion industry early on, less a seamstress versus designer. Can you talk about maybe like turn of the century and earlier about sexism that women may have faced in the fashion industry, and also like where we are today related to women designers and what they face?
Yes. So that's a great question. And it's really I think it would be, I mean, I think that's a whole exhibition in and of itself. I mean, it's a really multifaceted answer, but I guess in brief, to go back to the guild system, right? So we have the tailors and the seamstresses. um, that was, I mean, there was money to be made. So why wouldn't the men want to continue to regulate that and to control it? In the book, actually, I write an essay on the history of American fashion. And in the New England area, I don't know if there are any people who are from that area or from this area joining us, but, this was the hub of not only the shoemaking industry, but also the textile making industry. And many women were employed in these industries, but they were paid low wages. They were forced to work really long hours. And it was only until they decided to band together that they realized, like, oh, we actually can, make a difference here because they need us. And so that's where we start to see like the protest, or the bread and roses protest, where the national federal government actually had to intervene here, and it was because the foremen and the owners of those factories felt like the women were being paid enough. They made that decision. And then if you get into, all of the ethics that surround the presentation of clothing, from, the size and the age of models, that is a self-perpetuated sort of vicious cycle of control. And then we could go into an entire conversation about, diversity, equity, and inclusion in fashion magazines. But, one of the women who we didn't include, but whose story is absolutely worth exploring if you have an opportunity, is that of Eunice Johnson, who with her husband started Jet and Ebony fashion magazines. And she created the Ebony Fashion Fair. And she understood that, fashion could be used as a method of empowerment and as a method of access and exposure. And so she created these fashion shows that would travel from, across the country. But she, as a Black woman, would go into various outlets, and like anyone in fashion, asked to borrow something for a show, and people wouldn't lend. And so she said, okay, fine, I'll buy it outright, and would bring her checkbook. And so what happened is twofold. One is she amassed one of the best collections of contemporary fashion that has ever existed. And eventually, when people knew that Eunice Johnson was coming to town, they perked right up, because they were like, oh, she means business and she's going to pay. And so, I think that there is always this kind of cat and mouse dance that women have been doing in the industry. If we think about the term shop girl, right? I mean, there are only so many jobs that were considered appropriate for women, teaching, nursing, or working in retail. But you could only work at the base level. You could never be an executive. And so that's really kind of where we start to see women kind of poke holes in this.
That is a great answer, and I want to know a lot. I'm gonna do some searching and Googling tonight related to Eunice and everything else you mentioned. There are some questions that are pretty nitty gritty in here. Someone was commenting on the Colossus Sisters tours. And I think the photograph in the exhibition shows 3 sisters. Were they all designers, or
Oh.
were there 2 that were
So
designed?
there were initially 4,
Oh,
and unfortunately one passed away
mhm.
early in their professional history. And there were 3 then that worked together for the rest of the time.
Got it. Thank you. In the 1930s, did the fabric itself change to accommodate the bias cut?
Oh, good question. Yeah, definitely. The selection of fabric was a little bit more deliberate, I think, to have that kind of drape and that hand to it. And certainly there were lots of advancements in textile technology that were taking place at that same time.
Another question here about specifics of buttons, about women designing buttons. Have you thought about women designers of
Ooh, you know, I love that question, and thank you for asking it, whoever did. I have no idea, but I love buttons, and I know very little about buttons, I should say outright. But what I do know, I find to be fascinating. So I definitely think that that's worth more research.
I am very curious about the mannequins in the exhibition. You talk a little bit about changing the mannequins, whether it's the appendages, the bodies for the dresses. It looked like size-wise, some of the mannequins were different. Maybe like one in the swimsuit area was a little bit bigger. Um, what types of mannequins do you have in the museum? How do you make decisions about mannequins, especially like representation?
Yeah.
There are some mannequins that had different skin color. So I'm really curious about that.
No, thank you for asking. So for this exhibition, we exhausted our supply. We used every mannequin that we had available to us, and then if anyone had the opportunity to, but I should say, I should back up, but most of them, based on their previous exhibitions, were, shades of gray, dark gray, off-white, or white. And then I had an opportunity to visit the Pierre Cardin exhibition that the Brooklyn Museum of Art had done, and all of their mannequins were what they called pony brown. That was the name of the paint color. And on a whim, we reached out and I said, well, I don't know, they don't have a fashion collection proper, like maybe they don't need all their mannequins. So we ended up buying 40 mannequins from them because they didn't need all of them for the next show that they did. And so we got them at half price, which was great because I felt good about sustainability. So then we had 40 additional of these pony brown mannequins, which was a little bit more of a contemporary style. They're called Pucci mannequins. So if you look really closely at the heels, they're wedge versus the arch of the foot. And then we needed to order 30 more. And so then I started to look at, okay, so we've got pony brown, we've got gray, we've got owl gray, and we've got white. Like, how do we create sort of a bridge, between all of these colors, so it doesn't just feel so polarized. And so then what we did was we sat on the ground with these mannequins with paint chips, and created and selected a range of colors that really kind of acted as a bridge, so it wasn't so stark. And always, we try to the best of our ability to sort of piece each ensemble with each mannequin that we think is going to work, but you never know what's going to happen until you start dressing. Because the mannequins don't always like you, or they don't want to behave, and you have to sort of force them into something. And so, all of that kind of planning was sort of thrown out the window. But it all worked out, and I have to say that that kind of organic development, I think really lent itself quite nicely to the selection of mannequins that we did use and the way in which the people were presented. I will say that in general, most of the mannequins tend to be very slender. And in part, it's because we will add batting or padding to them to help, fill them out. But the one mannequin that you did see for the Chromat bathing suit, we did buy as a larger size mannequin because I purchased from that designer a large, because I wanted to also reinforce the idea that for her company, it was really about inclusivity and always was. And so it was important to have that there.
Thank you for that. And there's so much conversation about buttons in the chat. Someone is
Oh,
saying
fantastic.
so a lot of excitement around buttons. So I don't know if that will inform any of your future exhibitions.
Maybe we'll have to convene back and have a button expert come and talk to us.
So I can't end our evening without talking a little bit about First Ladies. At the National First Ladies Library, we've been talking a lot about power dressing and
Ooh.
First Ladies kind of communicating messages through what they're wearing, whether it's white to reference suffragists or Barbara Bush pearls, Nancy Reagan red. Can you talk a little bit about First Lady fashion beyond what is in the exhibition, as far as First Ladies as fashion icons?
Ooh, that's a good question. Well, let's see. I mean, I was thinking about Donna Karan and sort of the quote unquote cold shoulder dress that she wore or I'm sorry, that Hillary Rodham Clinton wore by Donna Karan, where I feel like that, was a moment where she was sort of exuding a little bit more sexiness than maybe we would necessarily associate with a first lady, because I do think that, first ladies, regardless of their personalities, are sort of forced to, be a little bit more austere. Certainly the choice by Michelle Obama to wear the Millie dress in her portrait, I think was very deliberate. And of course, in addition to the selection of the artist, I think that, Jason Wu, I mean, obviously there's always a tradition for first ladies to focus on American fashion, which I find to be really interesting, because it's, Carolina Herrera, I think, is a perfect example of somebody who was able to sort of bridge the aisle, right? Like, she designed for Melania Trump. She also designed for Michelle Obama. I mean, she designs for anyone, everyone. I mean, and I think a lot of that has to do with her like the classicness of her designs. Whereas like an Isabella Toledo and that yellow ensemble that was designed for Michelle Obama in the inauguration parade, that was a very specific color. It was a very specific pattern. But then thinking about like Frankie Welch, who is another person that you should absolutely go into further depth on. Not only was she a favorite of Betty Ford's, but she specialized in political scarves, and she designed for both Republican and Democratic parties. But one of her probably most famous designs is that of the Cherokee alphabet, which she sold specifically to raise funds for the Cherokee Nation. And so, I think that like designers and their collaboration and their partnership with First Ladies is a really interesting history. Certainly Molly Parnis and Adele Simpson. Adele Simpson was one of the first designers to really start to use cotton in a deliberate way. And she designed for several first ladies in the mid 20th century. And so I think that there's like a little bit of a, forgive the word, but like I do think that there's a little bit more of a democratic approach in the way that these women, these first ladies, are seeking out their designers. And more often than not, I actually see them working with female designers. And I don't know if that's deliberate or not. But with the exception of like an Oleg Cassini for Jacqueline Kennedy, most of the women are working with female designers. I guess Nancy Reagan loved Bill Blass too, so that's not totally fair.
So thank you for addressing First Ladies. I think the
You're
last thing
welcome.
I want to ask you is the exhibition is closed. So accessing like the walkthrough online, or is there, besides the catalog, where can we go to get the catalog? Is there more we can look at? And what are you working on next?
Oh, thank you for that question. Okay, so for the exhibition, we documented it to the best of our ability because we knew that so many people couldn't join us because of COVID. So there is a Facebook Live tour on the Peabody Essex Museum's Facebook page. But if you go to pem.org, PEM.org, there is an exhibition page too, where we did what we call a Matterport tour, which is actually a three-dimensional tour where you can go into the gallery itself and zoom in on all of the sections and zoom in on all the pieces. The publication is available in our shop. So again, pem.org, or it is also available, of course, on Amazon. And, if anyone has any questions specifically for me, I'd be more than happy to answer them or address them personally. Allison and Jenny and Michelle have my email address. And what are we working on now? Well, we do have a permanent gallery dedicated to fashion and design, which features our own collection. And it's really a look at how humans have engaged in design and what our motivations are for engaging in design. And so we do try to showcase our own collection in that. And we just did a rotation of about 20 pieces. And then moving forward in the next 2 or 3 years, we don't have any fashion exhibitions on the calendar just yet, but we're looking towards 2022 or 2023.
Well, thank you so much, Petra. This
You're
was really
welcome.
delightful. I want to let everyone at home know that you should be able to access this via Facebook or on the National First Ladies Library YouTube page. I also want to mention that we have an exhibition opening soon that is about First Ladies and the first 100 days of the administration. And I'm hearing from Michelle that 2 Frankie Welch scarves will be on display.
Yeah,
So we're
cool.
really excited about that, as well as a number of the Anlo perfume gowns that we own. So some of the things that Petra has discussed, if you are local to Canton, Ohio, please come to the National First Ladies Historic Site and check it out. So I want to thank everyone so much for joining us tonight. Petra, thank you so much for your time. This has
Thank
been
you.
delightful.
Oh, thanks.
And we hope to see you all again, hopefully in person or online in the coming weeks. Thank you so
Absolutely.
much.
Thank you. Thank you all. I appreciate it.
Good night.
Bye.